Hello, everybody. How are you doing today? I have a cup of tea. Most important piece of information out there. I hope you have a cup of tea too, or whatever your preferred beverage may be. Coffee, Pepsi, Coke, milk, whiskey, human blood, if you're a vampire. Like I said before many times, I don't judge. We are reading The Fury. I think this is part 6, but I've completely lost track. So far, we've got Brick, Cal, and Daisy. Brick and Cal have both been viciously attacked by literally anyone who comes anywhere near them. Those people lose their minds and they just try and kill them. And the same way that Benny died in the first chapter. We've also got Daisy. And all this is preceded by a thumping headache, thump, 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 that vanishes. And as soon as the headache vanishes, everyone seems to just see you as an enemy and try and attack you. So Brick and Cal are sheltering. Brick is in Fursville, an old amusement park. Cal is at home. He's just put a request into his computer to see if anyone else is having this problem. And Daisy skipped the school play because things were going very badly and went home and found out that her mum had killed her dad and herself because she felt like she was going to start hurting Daisy. And Daisy has just called for an ambulance and her headache has vanished. So this is Daisy's chapter. I apologise in advance, Daisy. Daisy, Boxwood St Mary, 4:13 p.m. Oh, how did it ever get in such a state? Daisy spoke the words beneath her breath as she brushed her mum's hair. It was easier than usual because her neck was really stiff, almost locked in place, which meant her head didn't jiggle. She worked it into a ponytail, trying not to notice how cold her mum's skin felt. She crawled over the bed, looking at her. It was so easy to forget. Don't say it, don't think it, it isn't true. The ambulance people will fix them. That they wouldn't be waking up this time. That they wouldn't yawn and stretch, that her dad wouldn't pat her head and her mum kiss her on the lips, that they wouldn't order Chinese as a treat and eat it in front of the telly. Daisy felt like she should be crying, but she was still numb all over, inside and out. The only thing she could really feel was a great big pressure in her chest, like something was sitting on her. It made it hard to breathe, and she had to keep taking great big gulping swallows of that horrible boxed cat smell, so that the room would stop going spinny and weird. She knew, or at least she thought she knew, that she was in shock. Although she didn't actually feel shocked, like she'd got a fright or put her hand in the plug socket. It wasn't like that at all. It was more like a big nothingness. The room was shifting, and Daisy looked up to see waves of thin blue light flicker across the window, like she was underwater. She went to kiss her mum on the cheek, but froze halfway at the thought of that damp, waxy skin against her lips. Instead she blew one, climbing off the bed as much to hide her guilty expression as to look out of the window. "They'll look after you," she said, pulling back the net curtain to see an ambulance outside, parked right behind their car, 2 wheels on the pavement. One man in green overalls climbed out, arching his back. The other was inside. Daisy couldn't make out his face because of the glare of the sun on the windscreen. The blue lights flashed, and Daisy suddenly realised that these strange men would be taking her parents away inside that thing, away to be buried or burned. That awful weight on her chest seemed to double, and she had to rest her forehead against the cool glass to stop from keeling over. The man in the street looked up. He squinted into the sunshine, putting a hand up to shield his eyes. Then he smiled sadly and waved. Daisy waved back, but she couldn't manage a smile. Her face felt as tough and plasticky as her mum and dad's. He glanced back inside the ambulance, then started walking towards the house, carrying a bag with him. He didn't seem in much of a hurry. Daisy made her way to the top of the stairs. She'd left the front door off the latch so that the ambulance people could come in, but the man rang the bell anyway, turning the handle as the chimes of Big Ben filled the house. From where she was standing, she could only see the bottom of the door, a pair of black shoes trampling over the mat. "Hello?" Daisy said. The man replied, but she couldn't quite make out what he said. It had started off like a word, hello, she thought, but by the time it had reached the L's, it was stretched out of shape, becoming more like a groan, a throaty purr that seemed to fill the hallway below. He took a lurching step forward, his legs coming into view. Then he snorted. "Hello?" she said again, uncertainty turning the word into a question. Ambulance people were nice, weren't they? They were supposed to be friendly and helpful and heal you when you were really sick. Then why was her tummy going funny? Because they're here to take your mum and dad away, that's all, she told herself. That would make anyone's tummy go funny. The man took another step, then another, his chest appearing, and then his shoulders, and then his... It wasn't the same man. Somebody else had come into her house. No, not somebody, but something. Something wearing the man's clothes and his hair and carrying his bag, but something that wasn't here to be friendly and helpful. This was something bad, something using the man's face as a mask, its mouth drooping open like a horse's mouth, the teeth huge and blunt and yellow. He lumbered up the steps in more of a hurry now than anyone Daisy had ever seen in her life, so fast that he tripped on one and banged his forehead on the wood. He didn't seem to notice, just crawled up them on all fours. The noise was deafening. Daisy waited until he was halfway up before the part of her brain that was saying, "Don't worry, he's here to help," was completely and utterly consumed by the part which screamed, "Get out of here! You have to run! He's a bad man!" She backed away down the landing, unable to take her eyes off him. He reached the top of the steps, trails of foam hanging from his lips, the whites of his eyes blazing. He used the banister to pull himself up, wrenching it so hard that the rail splintered free from the post. Daisy screamed, spinning around and running for the back room, the man's animal grunts right behind her. She made it, slamming the door closed and leaning against it. The man struck it a second later, the wood making a sound like a pistol shot. All the doors in the house had tiny privacy locks on, and she flicked it across just as the handle turned. The man threw himself at the door, a jagged tear running down the side. Daisy staggered back. This was the box room, barely big enough for a single bed against the wall, and the piles of old clothes which slept on it. And by the time she'd taken 3 steps, she'd hit the window. The door crunched again, specks of plaster drifting down from the ceiling. She could hear more footsteps too, hammering down the hallway. Fists and feet pounded the door. Why were they doing this? Why were they so angry with her? Did they think she'd killed her parents? "I didn't do it," she shouted, her voice lost in the thunder. "I didn't do it!" The door flew open so hard it ripped a chunk out of the wall. The man seemed to take up the entire room, a giant whose braying horse's mouth looked big enough to swallow her whole. Daisy's legs gave out, but before she hit the floor, his massive hands connected with her chest, shoving her through the window. Glass exploded. The universe shattered into 1,000 sparkling shards as Daisy fell. She hit the roof of the kitchen extension, pain like fire in every part of her body. She rolled, tumbling over the guttering, in mid-air once again until the rhododendron bush broke her fall. Even past the agony, past the roar of blood in her ears, Daisy could hear the screams of the men above her. She sat up, seeing nothing but fizzing silver light for a second before the garden popped back into view. She rolled out of the flower bed, not trusting her balance enough to stand up, crawling sideways down the garden like a crab. Only when she was past the sprawling bulk of the laurel hedge did she dare to look back. The box room window was empty. The shed at the bottom of the garden. It wasn't locked because it was falling apart, the roof all but caved in. She wrenched open the door and tumbled into the far corner. A fog of damp wood and slushy grass from the mower washed over her, but it was so much better than the stench inside the house. She breathed it in, hearing the familiar squeak of the back door. "Oh, don't find me. Please don't find me." She thought, her heartbeat so loud that the whole street must have been able to hear it. Footsteps rose up from the other end of the garden. Daisy pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible, even smaller than she actually was, as small as the woodlice that scuttled up her shoes. "Please, God, don't let them know where I am. I'm begging you." The noises grew quiet. Still, Daisy didn't dare move, even though her skin burned and she could see a blade of glass glinting in her arm, even though her shoulder and ankle throbbed. She hunched herself into the silence, her eyes screwed shut, praying, praying, praying. Voices. She could hear them, although not well enough to make out what they were saying. One of them she recognised. It was the old Scottish lady who lived next door, Mrs. Baird. She always gave Daisy a little box of Quality Street at Christmas and a £5 note for her birthday. The other voice was a man's, just a deep rumble. Incredibly, they were laughing. She couldn't bear it any more, not knowing what was going on. She eased herself up from the corner, skirting around the walls of the shed, careful not to trip on any loose firewood. Taking a deep breath, she peered through the grime-covered window. The ambulance men were there, both of them, only the second one was a woman, not a man. They were standing next to the fence in a puddle of broken glass. Mrs. Baird was leaning over from the other side, pointing up at the box-room window. The man shrugged, looking at the garden. Daisy ducked, but she couldn't stop herself from peeking out again. The lady paramedic walked into the house through the back door. The man was shaking hands with Mrs. Baird. "Those are the hands he pushed me out of the window with, the hands he tried to kill me with!" She wanted to scream. Both of them laughing again. Then he followed the woman inside. Daisy watched the door swing shut, half relieved that for some reason she didn't understand they seemed to have given up looking for her, but half wishing that they would stay outside because she knew that they were going to take her parents now, knew that they weren't going to let her say goodbye. She sat back down beneath the window, put her head in her hands, and started to cry. Poor Daisy. Brick, Fursville, 4:30 p.m. Oh, I love tea so much. I want to marry tea. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. Brick felt like taking the laptop out of Fursville and hurling it into the ocean. It was driving him crazy. He'd been sitting in the foyer for 4 hours now, and for the last 45 minutes or so, he'd had the computer on his lap, repeatedly loading up his Yahoo page. Apart from the adverts, there was nothing new every time the page displayed, just his desperate question and some tosser's idea of a funny reply. Brick wished he could find PWN U13 so that he could throw him down the basement with Lisa and watch her claw his throat out. Let's see who had psycho problems after that. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. "Oh, come on, you piece of junk," Brick shouted, grabbing the laptop by its screen and shaking it. The battery was dipping towards quarter full now. If it died, well, he didn't want to think about that. He should be conserving it, but the longer he sat here, the more anxious and angry he got. He swore, ready to start tearing his hair out. "Just work!" Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. This time he actually smashed his fist down on the keys, writing in the question box. He deleted it, replacing it with, "How would you like it if I smashed you on the floor and stamped on your stupid electronic guts?" He poked return, unsurprised when Yahoo couldn't find him an answer. He clicked back onto his page. No change. Refresh. No change. Refresh. No change. Refresh. No change. Even though it wasn't yet 5 o'clock, it seemed to be growing darker in the foyer. Colder, too. The thought of that blanket of night unfolding across the planet, ready to bury him and Lisa together, was terrifying. In the dark, he'd have no idea if she'd got out, if she was stalking the corridors, if she was standing right next to him. His body shuddered, and he pushed the image away. Something would happen before then. He'd work out what to do. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. His anger was like something living inside him, tendrils worming up his throat, into his brain, making it scream. His temper had never been very stable, the short fuse inherited from his old man. His dad's moods could change like a light switch being flicked. 1 second happy and laughing and joking around, and literally, the next thing his eyes would go dark and that smile would run from his lips and his hand would be out. Crack! "Don't mess around, Brick. Act your age, Brick. Just F off and mind your own business." Brick wasn't as bad as that. No way. But there had been times when he'd shouted at Lisa, when she'd got on his nerves so much that he'd almost lifted his hands to her. Almost. The closest it had ever come was when they'd been drinking cider at her house when her parents were out, and he'd thrown his glass into the corner of her room. He couldn't even remember why he'd been so furious that day. Something to do with her ex. He'd seen white, the world burning phosphorus. And in the second or two it took that feeling to pass, he could have done anything. Luckily, he hadn't hurt her. He honestly didn't think he could hurt her, except in self-defence. He just wasn't that sort of guy. As for hurting the laptop, though, he wouldn't have a problem with that if his temper reached 1,000 degrees again. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no... He'd got so used to the routine that it took him a few seconds to realise that something had changed. There was another answer below the first, and the shot of adrenaline that rocked Brick's system almost meant that he couldn't read it. He took a deep, shuddering breath and closed his eyes for a second, feeling a little calmer when he opened them. The response was from somebody called Cal Messi Ronaldo. "W2F, man. Are you serious? This has just happened to me too. I was at school and everyone attacked me for no reason, chased me onto the street and I had to steal a car to get away. I think I ran some people over. Why is it happening? What do I do? Brick leant into the screen, reading the message again, then again, then again, trying to work out if it was real or if it was another idiot who thought he was a comedian. There was nothing in it to suggest it was a joke, although it was hard to get a sense of somebody through a written message. Brick got the feeling that this guy, this kid, if he was attacked at school, was scared. He typed a response beneath the kid's answer. Look, I'm not messing around. This really happened to me. If you're being serious, then I need to talk to you. He paused, reading back over what he'd written, and then deleting it, starting again. I need to talk to you. I'll start a forum. I'll call it... He stopped again, trying to think. Hated, okay? It means we can talk where nobody will see it. Be quick, though. He posted it, checking the battery life of the laptop. Then he set up a new forum. Tell me what happened. Are you on your own? Has it happened to anyone else? I don't know what to do, he wrote. He thought about writing more, telling the kid about Lisa, but something was holding him back. This might be a trick. The police's way of finding out where he was. It was unlikely, but there was no way of telling for sure. Not yet, anyway. He'd wait to find out who he was, wait to see if he thought he could trust him. But he couldn't stop that calming blue wave of relief from damping the fire in his gut at the thought that maybe, he wasn't in this alone after all. Come on, Cal Messi Ronaldo, he said. Don't keep me waiting. He looked at the clock on the screen, 4:42. Then he settled back against the wall. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. Refresh, no change. Cal, Oakminster, 4:45 p.m. Cal pulled another jumper from the chaos of his wardrobe, stuffing it into the duffel bag on his bed. He'd already packed half a dozen t-shirts, all of his jeans and tracksuit trousers, and 2 more jumpers. He'd emptied his underwear drawers and wedged in a second pair of trainers. The little pack with his toothbrush and other stuff from the bathroom sat on his pillow, along with his mobile phone charger. Part of him still thought this was a stupid idea, but it was the same part of him which insisted that what had happened that afternoon was just a big misunderstanding, that there really had been a stampede from the stands and he'd simply got caught in the middle of it. It was the same part of him that claimed Naz hadn't meant to strangle him, that those people hadn't jumped on the car so that they could kick the living crap out of him. That part of him was wrong. They had tried to kill him. His friends and his teachers and strangers off the street. And if they had tried, then it made some kind of horrible sense that other people might give it a shot too. Other people like his mum. If that happened, then he needed to be ready. He pulled his coat from the hook on the back of the door. It was summer, hotter than he could ever remember it being, but he didn't know how long he might be out there. Out where, he asked himself as he laid it into the bag. Where are you going to go, Cal? He didn't know. Not yet. He'd think of something, though. He wouldn't be on his own. No, because everybody loves Callum Morrissey, right? Everyone loves him so much they just want to hug him and hold him until he falls to pieces. And maybe he wouldn't have to go anywhere. Maybe his mum would come home like she always did and give him a big cuddle and tell him that it would be okay. She'd look after him. That's what mums did, right? But even she had been acting weird that morning. She'd been acting just like his friends had before they'd tried to kill him. Ignoring that fact might cost him his life. He had a quick check inside the wardrobe to make sure he hadn't missed anything. Then he hefted the bag from the bed, it weighed a ton, and out into the upstairs hallway. He walked into his parents' room, an instinctive sense of guilt gripping him as he entered their walk-in wardrobe. Tucked at the back of the bottom shelf was his dad's safe. He got down on his knees, pulling out the musty collection of old shirts and throwing them to the side. His dad didn't realise that Cal knew the combination. The fact was he'd known it for about 3 years now, and it had taken him almost that long to work it out. Pretty much every time his parents had gone out, Cal had been in here trying out different sequences of numbers, birthdays, memorable dates, telephone numbers, mathematical equations he'd learned at school. Nothing had worked. But he'd never given up. He hadn't even known what was in the safe. His dad, whenever he was around, which wasn't often, had refused to tell him. It had become like a secret mission, like he was a spy and the safety of the world depended on him eventually cracking the secret. He'd grown obsessed with it. Eventually, when he was 14, Cal had worked it out. He'd been talking to his mum and dad over dinner one night. They'd both been in a great mood, better than he'd seen them in ages, and they'd been telling Cal about how they first met at a party in the West End. "Oh, you were gorgeous," his dad had said, flashing his mum a look that Cal hadn't really understood back then, but which he knew all too well now. "You were my very own perfect little 36, 24, 36. The numbers had been a mystery, but the next day when he'd got home from school he'd given them a go, unable to stop giggling when he'd heard the safe click and the small, solid door swung open. It did so now. their memory powerful enough to loose an insane surge of laughter up his throat. He choked it off, glancing into the bedroom to make sure he wasn't being watched, before turning his attention to the safe. Inside were the same things he'd first seen 3 years ago. On the right-hand side was a pile of money. Tens, 20s and 50s, all bound together in neat little bricks. The amount changed every time Cal looked, but he'd counted it once and it had tottered up to over 100 grand, more than enough for Cal to steal a few £100 every now and again and not be found out. Next to that was a small, flat, black box which contained his mum's most valuable jewellery. Resting on the box was a portable hard drive that he was pretty sure just had their family photos and things on. He'd never bothered investigating. And there was one more thing in the safe, and it was this that Cal reached for. It was heavy, so much heavier than it had any right to be, so much heavier than they ever looked in the films. The polished wooden grip fitted his damp palm perfectly, the dull silver barrel much longer than the toy airsoft BB version Cal had in his bedside cabinet. He flicked out the chamber, 6 empty holes peering back at him, then shut it with a deft flick of his wrist. He cocked the hammer, the tendons in his hand biting with the effort. Then he pulled the trigger. Click. He'd played with this gun for 3 years, cocking it, then firing it in 1,000 imaginary games. He'd even put bullets in it once, from the block box marked 38s at the back of the safe, although he hadn't dared pull back the hammer on that occasion, just in case he'd blown a hole in the wardrobe wall or his own leg. Cal found it hard to imagine his dad, who was balding, wore glasses, and was usually mild-mannered and gentle, with the gun in his hand. His mum always described him as a businessman, although it was a business that involved monthly trips to Spain and lots of dodgy characters turning up at the house after dark. Cal knew the truth in his heart, of course, although he never wanted to admit it. His dad was one of the bad guys. Cal picked up 2 bundles of cash, a couple of grand, he reckoned, and the box of bullets. Then he elbowed the door closed and spun the dial back round, hearing it lock. He paused for only a second, doubt nagging at the back of his mind. If he got caught outside with a gun, a real gun, then he wasn't going to get a slap on the wrist and a lecture from the cops. He was looking at a long, long time behind bars. But if he didn't take it... He saw the mob, those clawed fingers pinching him, knuckles pounding his skin, fat hands clamped around his throat. If he didn't take the gun, sooner or later, he would regret it. "Let's see you come after me now," he said softly, aiming the pistol into the bedroom. But the thought of firing it, of actually shooting somebody, made him queasy. He carried his stolen treasure back into the hall, placing the gun carefully in the bag, burying it in a nest of his clothes. He put one of the wads of cash in with it, then zipped the bag up tight. He looked at the other one, rifling it like a flick book, the Queen's unchanging face frowning back at him. Thoughts of new trainers or games for his Xbox bubbled up automatically to the surface of his brain, but he snuffed them out. If things were as bad as they looked, then this was survival money, food, shelter, maybe even transport to get him the hell away from here until whatever was going on had stopped going on. He stuffed the cash into the pocket of his tracksuit trousers, throwing the bag over one shoulder. He struggled downstairs, through the garden room, into the short corridor that led to the garage, leaving it by the door. Then he doubled back to the main lounge, stopping in the kitchen for a bottle of Dr. Pepper from the fridge. The computer was on, the Yahoo Answers page up where he'd left it. It had been the first thing to appear on Google when Cal had typed, "Why is everyone trying to kill me?" He took a swig from his drink, the sugar perking him up. Then he clicked the refresh button. There was a comment beneath his answer, and Cal felt a mixture of relief and panic as he read it. Relief because he wasn't on his own. Panic because if this had happened to somebody else as well, it meant that things were really bad out there. He ran the mouse over the guy's name, Rick_B. Then he clicked on the link to a private forum called Hated. The chances were that the man was nothing but an internet creep who was trying to get kids to talk to him. It didn't matter if he was. Cal had the gun now. He could defend himself. And maybe, just maybe, it was genuine. "Okay, Mr. B," he said as the forum loaded. "Let's see what you've got to say for yourself." Brick. Brick. Fursville, 4:50 p.m. Cal Messi Ronaldo. "It's like I said, I was at school playing football and everyone started chasing me, not for a joke. I thought that's what it was at first. Then they tried to strangle and punch me and they chased me right out of the school onto the street and others came after me too, like shoppers. I only got away because of the car. They would have killed me. What about you?" Brick put another fizzy cola bottle into his mouth, chewing slowly as he reread the post that had appeared below his own. He swallowed, then reached out and typed, "My girlfriend tried to kill me. She tried to bite my face off. Then she pretty much battered herself senseless trying to get to me through the door. I'm holed up somewhere safe, somewhere no one knows about. I need to find out what's going on. Any ideas?" He posted it, then took another sweet from the Haribo packet. He adjusted his position on the hard floor, wondering whether he should go upstairs to the restaurant where there were comfy chairs and tables. He didn't dare move, though, in case somehow he lost the connection to the one person who might be able to help him. He wanted to refresh the page right away, but he forced himself to wait for 5 minutes, actually counting slowly to 300 in his head. The immense quiet of the foyer almost sending him off to sleep again as he did so. And then he clicked. Cal Messi Ronaldo. No idea, scaring the shit out of me too. Ooh, sorry, swear word. I put an exclamation mark in it instead of an I in the book, so it's not technically. Out of me though. I'm at home, my mum's going to be back any minute. You think she'll attack me too? Where are you? Brick reached for another sweet, but the 7 or 8 he'd already eaten were dissolving unpleasantly in his empty stomach. He belched acid, swallowing it back down with a grimace. What now? Should he tell him about Hemingway, about Fursville? Or would that be too risky? He honestly didn't think it was a cop, and even if it was, there were rules against this sort of thing, weren't there? Entrapment or something. And surely the police would have a better grasp of English than this guy. He banged his head gently against the wall behind him, trying to knock a plan loose from his brain. He needed some kind of proof that the kid had been through the same thing. Rick B. What happened after? He posted the question, thinking about the way that Lisa had seemed to snap out of her fury, go back to being herself, the way she'd forgotten what she'd done. The memory scratched and bit inside his head, her blood-soaked voice pleading with him to let her go. Then the sight of her slumped and broken against the wall, still trying to get to him. He coughed out a painful sob, refreshing the page to see 2 posts waiting. Cal Messi Ronaldo. I shit myself, that's what happened after. What do you mean? Cal Messi Ronaldo. Oh, actually, I got a call from my mate, one of the ones who'd attacked me, if that's what you mean. She didn't remember what she'd done. Where are you? There was no way the police could know that, right? They might have found out that he'd been attacked by reading his Yahoo question, but they couldn't know that Lisa had gone back to normal as soon as he was out of sight. He flexed his fingers, nodding to himself as he typed. Rick B. I'm on the coast, a place called... And that was as far as he got before another thought crossed his mind. This guy had been attacked in the same way as him, but did that mean he wouldn't attack Brick, or vice versa, when they came to face to face? He'd kind of assumed that maybe they had something in common, that maybe they were immune to each other or something, but he knew absolutely nothing about what was going on here. He certainly didn't know the rules of how this thing worked. The last thing he needed was another crazy person trying to kill him. He'd end up with a pavilion full of locked doors with psychos behind them, his very own bedlam. So what then? Brick deleted what he'd written, starting again. Rick B. I'm in Norfolk, on the coast. I can tell you where to meet me. We need to be sure we can trust each other, that we won't try and kill each other, okay? Where are you? He posted it. They didn't have to meet at Fursville. Pretty much the whole of Hemingway was a ghost town, just the fertiliser factory inland, then the Sainsbury's about 3 miles to the north on the road over to Winston. There were a few houses up there that way, old people in bungalows mainly, but he'd never encountered any of them close to the park. He just couldn't see a bunch of old grannies climbing over the fence to sit on the rotting wooden horses of the carousel. He refreshed the forum. Cal Messi Ronaldo. London, Oakminster. I can probably get to you in a few hours if I get out of the city. Tell me where. I've got to get out of here real soon. Crunch time. Yes or no? Brick's fingers hovered over the keys and he chewed his bottom lip like it was another sweet. He was better on his own. He always had been. He wasn't good with other people. They either picked on him or pissed him off, and this kid with a name like Cal Messi Ronaldo was probably some footballer or something. Pretty much number one on Brick's list of people he hated, and people who hated him. If he told them about Fursville, then the chances were they'd end up killing each other anyway, even if they weren't affected by what was going on. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was that he stayed here by himself, Lisa dying in the basement, if she isn't already dead. Him slowly growing crazy in the creaking, rusting remains of his childhood paradise. Rickby, you need to head north, right up the coast. There's a village called Hemingway, Google map it, just up from Hemsby. It's deserted. About a quarter mile from the village sign there's a track going off to the right, to the beach. Loads of dunes and stuff. At the end of it is a car park, well overgrown, and an old toilet block that's boarded up. That's not where I'm staying. That's just a place we can meet without being seen. If you're leaving now, you can get there for 8. If you're late, just wait there overnight and I'll try again tomorrow. Don't bring anyone else, okay? If you're not alone, I won't even show myself. He read it back through, feeling ridiculous, like he was doing a hostage negotiation or something. But it paid to be careful. He posted, read it through again, then typed something else into the text box. Good luck. He closed his eyes, letting his head drop. He felt exhausted, which wasn't a surprise considering what he'd been through. He didn't want to sleep, though. He didn't want to close his eyes now and wake up to find that darkness had fallen, that he was alone here with his nightmares. He logged back onto Yahoo, wondering whether he should wipe his original question, at least until he found out what had happened when he met this guy. Found out what happened when he met this guy. He clicked onto it, the arrow hovering over the delete question option, his thumb ready to tap the trackpad button, and he almost didn't notice them until it was too late. He scrolled down the page, his eyes widening, his pulse quickening as he took in what he was seeing. There are currently 8 answers to your question. More people. How are we doing for time? Yeah, plenty of time. More tea. Cal, Oakminster, 5:05 p.m. Cal sat in the driver's seat of his mum's Freelander convertible, the engine purring quietly and the nose nudged out of the right-hand garage door. He'd put it in neutral so that he could rest his foot off the clutch, and his leg jiggled with nervous impatience as he kept watch on the gate. To his left was the car he'd escaped him, the blood now dried into vein-like rivulets along its sides and its shattered windscreen, its roof caved in like a fruit bowl. His bag was on the back seat of the 4x4, along with 3 carrier bags stuffed with crisps, sweets and drink. With any luck, he wouldn't need it. With any luck, his mum would come through the gate, see him sitting in her car and have a massive bug out, mad but not psycho-mad. He shuffled in his seat, feeling like his insides were lodged in his throat. His right hand gripped the wheel so hard that he didn't think he could let go, even if he wanted to, his left resting on the gear stick. They told the true story. He was pretty sure he'd have to make his getaway a quick one. He didn't know yet what his plan was, if the worst came to the worst. The guy he'd talked to online, Rick_B, sounded weird. Cal hadn't got a good vibe from the few messages they'd exchanged. What kind of person picked an old abandoned toilet in an old abandoned village to meet in? Yet his message had sounded pretty genuine. And what option did he really have? He couldn't exactly head west into the most heavily populated city in Europe. East was Southend and the ports, 24-hour industrial hubbub. South were the endless queues into Dartford Tunnel. Sure, there were a few quiet places around here, hundreds of fields within driving distance, plus the country park where he could shelter in the trees. But what was he supposed to do? Live like Stig of the Dump for the rest of his years? At least if he headed north, he'd be moving away from the city into the ghost lands of East Anglia. Somebody walked past the wheelie bin outside the gate, and Cal jumped, his twitchy right foot revving the engine. It was an old man shuffling along, holding a Waitrose bag that was almost as big as he was. Sunlight glinted off his specs. He didn't look in. On the other side of the street, one of the neighbours was loading something into her car. The sound of the door slamming and her feet crunching across the gravel seemed to carry too far, too loud on the heat. Cal ducked down in the leather seat, keeping his head as low as possible. He turned on the radio to try to calm his nerves, flicking impatiently through the stations and settling on Kiss FM. Something trancy filled the car, making him want to floor the pedal right now and just get the hell out of there. There was a thump. Cal's head jolted up to see the wheelie bin lid open. It slammed shut to reveal his mum behind it. She grabbed the handle and pulled it into the drive, that hollow rumble, the loudest thing in the world. What if she attacked him? Oh, she won't. She can't. What if she came at him like the others, tried to open the door and pull him out so that she could stomp on his head with her Uggs? It was his mum, for Christ's sake. His mum. The closest she'd ever come to hurting him was a gentle slap when he was 9 because he'd sworn at her. Even that had hurt for much longer than it should have. A slap from your own mum is like a sledgehammer to the face. They were powerful that way. Oh, please be normal, Cal whispered. She was halfway down the path when she heard the mutter of the car engine. She stopped, putting her hand up over her face, peering at him through a mask of shadow. In her purple top and black jeans, she looked a bit like Batgirl. Cal gripped the wheel, the fake wood slick inside his sweat-drenched palm. His words dried up inside his mouth, his tongue suddenly like sandpaper. A car drove past on the street outside, and his mum peeked over her shoulder. When she turned back to her, Cal, she lifted her hands, her bright red nail polish like rubies, and shrugged dramatically. "Cal, what the hell are you doing?" she said, her voice muted. Cal Cal let out a breath that he hadn't even realised he'd been holding. Suddenly the sun seemed twice as bright, the leaves on the trees and bushes a brilliant shade of green that he hadn't even known existed until now. She was okay. She was normal. His mum let go of the wheelie bin and it rocked back on its wheels, rattling. She took a step towards him. "Turn that engine off right now, young man," she said, walking towards the garage. Cal grinned at her, reaching for the key. "It's okay," he shouted, wondering how the hell he was going to get the gun back into his dad's safe without her noticing. "I was just having a laugh." "You're going to be in big trouble, young man," she said. Cal froze. His mum's face had come loose. One side of her mouth was drooping, her left eye too big, too red. She took another step, swaying this time. "Get out of the car, Cal." His name stretched from her lips, horribly distorted, dripping out alongside strings of saliva. His mum lurched across the last 10 metres of the drive, her face slipping even further like a mask that had been badly glued on. She hit the bonnet of the Freelander hard enough to jolt the car, her hands squeaking on the metal as she clawed her way towards his window, still groaning that guttural version of his name. This close, Cal could see that her eyes were like hot coals, full of darkness, and yet blazing with heat. "Mum?" Cal said. He shook his head, unwilling to believe what he was seeing, even though deep down he'd known that this is what would happen, even though there was nothing left of his mum in the thing that pounded on his window with small, brittle fists, coating it with spittle as her voice grew into a banshee scream. "Mum, I'm sorry!" He put the Freelander in gear and pulled away slowly so as not to hurt her. She ran alongside, thumping the windows hard enough to leave smudges of orangey blood there. He pulled out onto the pavement, not looking where he was going. His eyes were on the rear-view mirror, on the figure that lumbered after him like a zombie, her face so familiar and yet so alien. She lost her footing on the gravel and plunged from view, and it took everything he had not to stop the car and go and help her. "Goodbye," Cal tried to say. Then he floored the accelerator, lifted the clutch, and roared up the street. Brick, Fursville, 6:07 p.m. Brick couldn't believe what he was reading. "This is happening to me too. I got attacked by my brother. I still need help as I can't walk." It was right at the bottom of the page, posted by somebody called Amo Twin 3, literally 2 minutes ago. It was the 12th answer. Above that was the 11th by Joe Abraham. "Don't call the police. They tried to kill me. I am not joking. Happened last night. Only got away by jumping in a river. Mum was one of them. Thought she was going to strangle me. I'm at my dad's place because he's away for the summer, but there's people all over and I ain't going outside unless I got somewhere safe. Where you at, bruv?" They'd both just appeared, the last time he'd refreshed the page. Brick scrolled up, his hand trembling so much that he kept losing his place. He'd read the other entries over and over. Not all of them were serious. Somebody had written "You guys are massively weird" for answer number 7, but the rest were so similar that they could have been left there by the same person. He scanned through them for the billionth time, shaking his head as the same sentences leapt out at him. "She broke my arm. She was trying to pull it right off. They all just came after me like they hated me. I went to the hospital and it was the same there. One tried to scalpel me. Please help me. I don't know what to do." They pretty much all ended along those lines too. Please help. Like Brick was some messiah who could lead them all to salvation. The hell with that, though. He didn't even know what was going on himself. He put the laptop on the floor so that he could stretch out his legs. Pins and needles radiated from his backside. He could just switch the laptop off and ignore everything he'd read. He could delete his question and the answers would vanish alongside it. He might even be able to convince himself he'd never seen them. No, he couldn't do that. He could no more leave a bunch of people to die than he could run over the ocean. And they sounded so young too. That's why the messages had all seemed similar. The language, the spelling, the lack of grammar. They were written by kids. He couldn't be sure, of course. There was just something in those messages that made him fairly confident that they weren't adults. The laptop sat open, the screen almost fully dark to conserve the battery. But those messages were still visible, staring up at him, imploring. Okay, he muttered to them. But not before I know you're all not going to go psycho on me, okay? That was the best solution. He'd go out and meet Cal Messi Ronaldo, and if they didn't end up tearing each other's throats out, then maybe he'd send word to the rest of them. This other guy might have some better ideas too. He checked the clock. It was only a 20-minute walk to the car park from here, but he could do with stretching his legs properly, getting some air that didn't smell of bird crap and rot. He pushed the lid closed with his foot, hearing the laptop go to sleep. Then he set off back down the maintenance corridors, stopping at the top of the basement steps for no more than a second. It's fine. It's quiet. No need to check. No need to go down there. She's fine. Before it felt like his heart was about to slip from his throat and plop down the stairs like a slinky. And was it quiet down there? Wasn't that a gentle scraping he could hear, nailless fingers on wood? He almost ran the last few metres to the fire door, crawling and kicking through the chains like a man pulling himself from his grave. Cal, the M11 motorway, 6:10 p.m. This was bad. Really bad. And it had been going so well. A clear path out of Oakminster, the main road free of traffic despite the fact that everybody was leaving work. He'd had to stop once at the set of lights they'd just put in for the giant new Asda, but nobody had crossed. The woman in the car behind him had started to get out, but the lights had changed before she could stagger over. The sat-nav had offered him a choice of routes, via Ipswich or Norwich. Some inner voice had drawn him irresistibly to the second option. Now he was wishing he'd ignored it. He'd taken the back roads onto the M11, happy keeping the Freelander at 70 in the middle lane, passing people too quickly for them to see him or sense him or whatever was going on. Traffic had been fast on the motorway, and it was only about an hour after setting off when he finally let himself think that he might actually be okay that luck took a massive crap right on his head. The electronic boards were flashing a warning at him. Accident, long delays between junctions 8 and 9, and he could see the gridlocked traffic from half a mile away. The inside lane had been barricaded by a police van, its flashing blue lights multiplied 100-fold in the windows of the cars that purred motionlessly alongside it. Further down he could see a pillar of smoke rising almost perfectly straight into the calm blue sky. He slowed, keeping to the middle lane as the cars started to converge around him. "Take the next exit," the sat-nav lady suddenly barked at him, making him jump. "I'll try," he replied, "but it isn't going to be easy." The brake lights from the car in front blazed, and he slowed from 40 to 25. Something big trundled by on his left, hydraulic brakes hissing, plunging him into shade. Behind him an old Mercedes was pulling up fast, the driver a hunched shadow behind the wheel. This was really, really bad. The car in front reached the back of the queue and stopped dead. Cal slammed on his brakes at the last minute, the Freelander rocking to a halt. Another lorry pulled up on his right, squealing, and it got even darker inside the car, the steep-walled containers on either side making him feel like he was inside a grave. "Stay calm, just stay calm," he told himself. "They don't know who you are, they're not going to come after you." Then why was the guy in front climbing out of his ugly green Fiat? It was a middle-aged man, dressed in sweats and trainers like he was going to the gym. He stopped with one leg in the car and one leg on the motorway, stooped over, frozen. The Mercedes behind was closer now, the driver gunning the engine. Was he speeding up? The Fiat man seemed to remember what he was doing, dragging his left leg out of the car. Then he turned to Cal. "Oh no," Cal said as the man's face changed, his cheeks sagging like old cloth, his lower eyelids drooping to reveal the red-veined orbs of his eyes. He staggered forwards like a marionette, throwing himself at the raised bonnet of the Freelander just as the Mercedes slammed into it from behind. Cal's car lurched into the back of the Fiat, the man caught in a bear trap. There was a crack, a spurt of blood from his misshapen mouth, then he vanished between them. The impact threw Cal forward, his face hitting the centre of the wheel hard enough to honk the horn. He crashed back, wondering why the airbag hadn't gone off, trying to make sense of the world through the supernovas that detonated in his vision. Fiat guy had to be dead. Mercedes guy wasn't moving, but Cal could make out other people climbing from their cars further down the queue. There were 7 or 8 of them making their way towards him, all with looks of concern, some with their phones out, others beckoning urgently to the police van in the inside lane. One by one, as they stepped past an Argos lorry maybe 20 metres away, their expressions changed, their pace increasing as they lurched and stumbled towards his car. Cal fumbled it into first gear, praying that the crash hadn't done any damage as he hit the gas. There was a deafening crunch, the squeal of metal against metal, but the Freelander didn't budge. He looked over his shoulder at the Mercedes crammed up against him, its bonnet crumpled and smoking. He was pinned tight between them. He swore, wrenching the stick into reverse, flooring the pedal and shunting the car back a metre or so. A hand thumped on his window, somebody trying the handle. Cal didn't look, just threw it into first gear again and rammed the back of the Fiat, freeing up another bit of space. Somebody was screaming, half words buried in the noise as they battered the glass with their fists. One of the people from the queue, a teenage girl, was trying to climb onto the bonnet, but Cal reversed again and sent her tumbling to the floor. He managed a little more momentum this time, knocking the Merc back far enough for him to break out. He swung the wheel all the way to the left, nudging the wrecked Fiat out of the way. There was hardly any room between it and the lorry to his side, but he didn't let up, squeezing through, serenaded by more shrieking metal. Somebody was on the back of the car, trying to tear through the canvas roof, 2 black blisters of eyes boiling through the hole that he'd made. More people were surging up the aisles between traffic, and for a second Cal thought they had him, that there was no way out. Then he squeezed past the lorry to see that the car in front of it was a smart car. He pulled hard to the left again and rammed it. He was only doing 20, but the weight of the Freelander pushed the tiny thing in front out of the way like it was a toy, rolling it onto its side and clearing a path onto the hard shoulder. Cal accelerated onto it, passing the police van close enough to rip its bumper off, hitting 50 in 5 seconds. The man on his roof had gone. Up ahead he could see the source of the smoke he'd spotted earlier, a car that had come off the road, punched through the barrier and down the bank to the side. It sat in a field surrounded by people, hundreds of them swarming all over it, the same way they'd swarmed over him back at school. They didn't seem to care about the black clouds that billowed from the engine. They were just tearing and scratching and kicking and even biting at the metal like starving rats trying to get at the meat inside a bin. He eased his foot onto the brake as he drew level, slowing to about 20 before realising what he was doing. Some of the people on the smoking car looked up, a couple of them tumbling free from the pack and starting to run up the slope towards the road. The crowd behind was catching up too, a tide of flesh filling his rearview mirror. Then he heard it. Although heard was the wrong word, because this was nothing to do with his ears. There was something in his head, something that wasn't him, a voice that at the same time wasn't a voice. It seemed to grab time and pull it to a halt. The people all around him running in slow motion like those new high-def cams they used for the football. The voice seemed to be the opposite of noise, a profound silence that cushioned the world and yet which still somehow communicated with him. And in that instant, Cal knew exactly what was inside that car. It was a person, somebody just like him. And they needed help. The world unspun like a clockwork toy that had been wound up tight, reality snapping back. The screams from outside were deafening now, more people pounding and scraping at the Freelander. Past faces ravaged by hate, Cal could make out the car below, bodies squirming all over it. He accelerated hard, swinging to his left, grinding past flesh and bone as he headed for that broken barrier. He didn't know what he was going to do when he got to the wreck, but he had to do something. The lightning came before the thunder. The car in the field erupted in a ball of white heat that sent charred corpses spiralling out in all directions. Cal had time to see a fist of smoke punch up towards the heavens, and something inside that smoke, an impossible shape of blue flame which opened its mouth and howled, before the shockwave hit the Freelander, peeling away the people outside and blowing in the passenger windows. He shielded his face, poisoned air clawing into his lungs, the 4x4 bouncing on its wheels so hard he expected it to roll over. By the time he lifted his head, the worst of the explosion had passed. Smoke still gushed skywards like liquid from the blazing car, but there was nothing in it except darkness. The engine had stalled, and Cal turned the key to bring it back to life. He swung the wheel to the right, accelerating away from the carnage, away from the burning shapes that ran and howled and fell in his mirrors. There was one police car on the hard shoulder, but he passed it with plenty of room. The queue continued up the motorway, faces peering out of car windows at the smoke-darkened skies, but the exit was clear. "Continue on the current road," said the sat-nav. Cal wiped the ash from his stinging eyes, trying not to think about the people who had been on the car, 20, 30, maybe more, all dead. Trying not to think about the person inside it, the wordless voice somehow begging him for help, which had vanished like a radio being turned off the moment that the car had exploded. Trying not to think about the shape in the smoke, that figure of flame which screamed as it rose. He let the fresh air empty his head, and he drove on. Oh my goodness. Got time for one more? Yeah, why not? Daisy one. I like Daisy. Do we have ties? Oh, no, we do. Daisy. Boxwood St Mary, 6:58 p.m. Daisy crawled through the garden like a lioness, the ones she enjoyed watching on the telly. They were so graceful, so quiet, and she tried to imitate them as best as she could as she crept forward on all fours, making sure to always stay hidden in the overgrown bushes. She hadn't seen anyone inside the house for ages. The horrid ambulance man had last appeared maybe half an hour ago. It might have been less. He'd gone back inside after smoking a cigarette, chatted to some police in the kitchen, then they'd all filed out, and that was the last she'd seen of them. Of course, they might still be inside, hiding in the shadows, ready to jump out at her. The thought of that ambulance man's horse face braying at her, his rough hands pushing her out of the window, stopped her dead. She twisted her hand in the long grass, locking herself to it, smelling the roses in the rhododendrons and the buddleias. It reminded her of her mum, her poor mum. It had come back and it had been eating her brain, just like before. The tumour had made her act weird last time, but only twitches and ticks and the occasional word that came out wrong. This was so much worse. She had killed Dad. She had killed herself. It wasn't the cancer, though, Daisy thought, remembering the note. She said it wasn't the disease, it was something else. She knew what was coming, that she was going to hurt you. The thoughts were painful, and she pushed them away, untangling her hand and creeping towards the back door. There was a big bald patch of lawn between the last bush and the house. If she crawled over that, then anyone inside would be able to see her. She glanced right, the flower beds full of thorny things, and past them the passage up the side of the house. To the left, Mrs. Baird's garden. The nice old lady's apple trees hung over the low fence, a pool of shadow beneath them. Daisy skirted towards them, grateful when she plunged into the shade. She could hear something on the other side of the fence. It might have been Pudding and Wolfie, Mrs. Baird's cats. She started forward again. About 10 metres or so from the bush where she'd landed after her fall from the box-room window, Daisy saw the first shard of glass, about the size and shape of one of the steak knives in the kitchen. It was nestled in the dirt, a line of blood down one side. Sunlight shone through it, painting the grass a vivid shade of red, making Daisy think of cathedral windows. She half thought about picking it up and putting it in her art box. It was so beautiful, until she remembered that it was her blood. She stood up, not wanting to cut her knees and elbows on the twinkling scalpels of glass between here and the house, squatting to stay low below the fence. It was hard walking like this, but there wasn't far to go. The noises to her left were louder now, but she could definitely hear the familiar meow of cats. It was the noise they made when Daisy snuck out some prawns or tuna for them after dinner, the noise they made when they were being fed. But if she wasn't feeding them? Daisy glanced over her shoulder to see a figure half hidden behind the knotted trunk of one of the apple trees. It was wearing an ancient brown dressing gown, and smoky puffs of thin white hair billowed out from the pink scalp beneath. One small black eye peeked from the shade, looking right at her. "Mrs. Baird?" Daisy asked, coming to a halt, still on her haunches. "Is everything okay?" The nice old lady was breathing hard, almost grunting. There was a clatter of wood, and one of the cats, Daisy could never tell them apart as they were both black, jumped onto the fence. It wobbled, catching its balance, rubbing its head on Mrs. Baird's sleeve and making the same "I'm hungry" protest. Mrs. Baird ignored it, still staring at her with that one dead eye. Daisy straightened, taking a few steps towards the back door, and she'd just grabbed the handle when the old lady threw back her head and screamed. It was a horrible sound, like she was having a heart attack or something, and Daisy almost went to her, her first instinct to help. With a phlegmy cry, Mrs. Baird hurled herself against the fence, the wooden panels bowing under her weight. Bowing, 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 bowing. One of those. She lost her grip, disappearing with a sickening snap. "Oh, that's a broken bone," Daisy thought as her neighbour reappeared, her body trembling, great trails of saliva hanging from her pale lips. She was still grunting, the noise a pig might make. Daisy turned the handle, pushing the door, almost banging her head on it when it wouldn't open. She tried again, using both hands this time. It was locked. There was another gut-wrenching noise, then something thudded to the ground. Daisy looked to see that Mrs. Baird had managed to flop over the fence and was now lying in a heap, trying to get up. Her arms and legs wriggled in the air like a beetle on its back, her dressing gown open to reveal the velour tracksuit underneath. One of her slippers was gone, and there was something wrong with that bare ankle. It was pointing the wrong way up. Daisy turned back to the door, wrenching the handle, kicking the bottom hard enough to make the glass rattle. "Come on!" she screamed at it, suddenly wishing that the police were still inside, that anybody was still inside. Mrs. Baird was no longer trying to get to her feet. She had flipped herself over and was scuttling across the garden on all fours the same way Daisy had been earlier, her wrinkled fingers pulling out clods of dirt as she clawed forwards. Daisy kicked the door once more, then backed away, heading for the side passage that led to the street. Mrs. Baird was gaining, her sagging face filled with exhaustion, but those piggy eyes even more determined than Daisy had ever seen them. Her glistening mouth gaped wide, breathing in the same short, piercing, double-shriek cries that might have been her name. "Daisy! Daisy! Daisy!" broken and clogged with spit. She ploughed across the grass, her arms and legs moving too fast for an old woman, like there was a horrible clockwork machine under her skin. Daisy turned and fled into the passage, not knowing where she was going, not caring about the voices she could hear from the street outside, just wanting to get away from the thing that crawled after her, that called her name with each wheezing breath. Oh, poor Daisy. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. And then, the next chapter's a long one. We are cracking through this book, though. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. What can I say? It's horrible. It's a horrible book. Horrible things happen. I'm sorry to Mrs. Baird. Mrs. Baird is my gran's name. Well, was my gran's name before she passed away. And I always imagined my gran chasing me across the garden. Well, not always. It's not something I've always imagined. But, when I was writing this book, just like ploughing across the garden mechanically. Because my gran was such a lovely lady. I could just... but if she had the fury. So that's who I had in my head. So, sorry, Gran, if you're listening to this from wherever you might happen to be now. I've completely gone off track, but it's nice to see you all. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for tuning in. And I will see you all hopefully tomorrow for the next part of the Fury. Take care, have fun, I love you. See you soon. Bye.